Just FYI, this is the core series, so we're working through the design thinking process. So hopefully you've been to start with the problem or define the problem. Heart of the customer, where we talked about using empathy and customer discovery to figure out what the end user actually needs and wants. And today we're here with Scott because he's going to talk about prototyping. And you're basically going to learn what a prototype is and kind of the process to develop one, hopefully through the story that Scott has of how his organization has relied on prototyping to not only make a successful product, but to also gain valuable feedback. So before I pass it off to Scott, I want to just let you know, Scott is the CEO and co-founder of Every Shelter. And his organization has basically worked to relieve the suffering of those who have been displaced by war, persecution, and disaster through the design and delivery of shelter products. And so he has a first product that Every Shelter was kind of founded on or started with, which was a flooring product. And it actually began during Scott's time as a graduate student in the Rice School of Architecture. So with that, his organization, are committed to collaboration and partnership, and they use human-centered design and kind of the design thinking process a lot of the time, most of the time, all of the time, I could say. So he'll talk more about that. I'm going to pass it off to him. Scott is here for prototyping. Take it away, Scott.
Great. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Let's see if that works. All right, y'all are able to see this?
Yes.
Yes.
See if I can full screen it. Okay. Thank you, Stacy. Stacy and I knew each other in undergrad, yeah. So like Stacy talked about, we make physical goods, and I want to start a workshop about prototyping to say that prototyping is often seen as a physical thing, but is by no means necessarily physical. When we prototype, it often manifests itself in a physical good. So I can't speak always to all forms of prototyping. We don't do UX, we don't do, web coding. A lot of prototyping nowadays is based there, but I can kind of talk about our experience. So what you're seeing behind on this screen is our flooring system. It is the final iteration of the floor, and we'll walk through kind of some of the early days of that. I like this quote a lot with prototyping. Prototyping allows us to fail early so we can succeed sooner. I think I'm not sure where everybody is at in their own education, what their background is. I know that you guys have some exposure to Lean Canvas, Lean Startup training. And it really is this mentality that you want to develop a testable thing, whatever your thing is, and so that you can prove out its viability, find some of its failure points before you go to market with something. And that's really kind of the essence what a prototype is. But the prototyping process and the design process is often not just one loop, right? As indicated by the loops above. It's often a very iterative process where, hopefully you get increasingly more sophisticated with what the prototype is, and often a company or an enterprise isn't just prototyping one time. It's multiple prototypes. So I thought it'd be useful to start with a little bit of vocab because people tend to use these words interchangeably.
I'm just going to interrupt you real quick. I'm not sure you're sharing your screen, full screen, or the slide yet. So just wanted to check with you.
Interesting. Okay. I'm not sure.
Because I think you had a quote slide and different things. We weren't seeing that yet.
I did. Is it sharing?
That's better. Yes. Thank you.
Hey guys. I've given a presentation before, I promise. Flooring, cool quote, cool diagram. Now we're up to date. You've seen all the slides. So I thought I'd start with a vocabulary lesson. People tend to use a lot of these terms interchangeably, proof of concept and prototype especially. In theory, a proof of concept is really you're testing a piece of a system. So you're trying to prove the viability of one thing that you're not sure whether it works or not. Oftentimes, that gets used interchangeably with prototype, especially if something is not a terribly complex system. So if you're talking about a series of algorithms and codes that all have to work together and then, integrate into some other piece of software. The proof of concept may just be one line of code. And I'm already talking outside of my expertise. But a prototype is really testing that whole system together. And then a pilot, and this is my own interpretation, really, a pilot is really taking that final version of your prototype kind of before you're going mass scale, and you're putting it in the real world, giving it to the end user, whatever that looks like in your case, and you're asking them to take the prototype and test it and see what its positives and negatives are. And then an MVP, this is again my definition, minimum viable product. That is not my term. That's commonly used. But one definition of an MVP would be like a commercializable prototype. You recognize that there may be more features, more benefits that you can add to whatever your product is, but it's a really kind of scaled back. So that kind of, and that can almost be seen somewhat sequentially, although going back to my last slide, often you're kind of running through that proof of concept prototype pilot, looping before you even really get to an MVP. So those first three are really kind of, you may do those multiple times. So I'm going to talk through our own story. The first product that we developed, like Stacy said, I was a grad student pursuing a master's of architecture. The design prompt that we had was disaster related, right? Disaster housing. And so we designed a box that housed a lot of disaster goods, toilet, tent, water purification, anything a family might need to survive on for a period of time. And the concept behind that was that box would then be taken apart and reassembled as the floor to the shelter. And so the kind of driving concept behind it was just that the packaging becomes something useful when it's done. And, prototypes, like you see here, it's often not the most refined version, but it's really demonstrating something, right? And what we were wanting to demonstrate is that instead of wasting the packaging, can the packaging become something useful in the final iteration? As it turns out, the floor that we created was probably the most interesting thing that we created. And it sent us on a trajectory of really exploring how do we create a maximally useful flooring in the humanitarian context. This slide is showing kind of that trajectory, and there's iterations here that we explored that aren't here. But this is kind of condensing all the varying prototypes that we created on that journey. And you can kind of see a little bit of an evolution there, where you start in the bottom left. It's a vector of what I just showed you. We started exploring, can a shipping pallet also form a crate to then become a floor, and then we distilled that down even further. In the next slide, you'll see, can we actually take somebody else's shipping pallet and create an intervention that would create a useful floor out of that, and then one more step along the process, and we end up with the floor that we have. One thing that I wanted to say along our journey is that a prototype doesn't always have to be physical. Sometimes it can, even for a physical product, can exist completely digitally. So when we got started in grad school, IKEA had decided that they wanted to create a refugee shelter and help solve some of the problems around the refugee context that we work in. They didn't have a floor at the time. And so one of our early prototypes was this kind of one that you see at the middle, this roto-molded shipping pallet that actually is also a floor once it's at its final destination. And we never physically made one. We 3D printed at varying scales, which is a useful tool for physical prototyping, but never a full 2.5 foot by 4 foot unit as it was designed to be. We never had that kind of capital, but we were able to Photoshop our floor with their shelter. And we sent this image on to them, and we said, hey, look, we heard you're looking for a floor. We sent them some other material, but this was enough to get us invited to Sweden, and they paid for us to come and test an early prototype in their shelter, because they weren't at market either. They were still in prototyping phase, and they were looking for a flooring solution. So this version of a prototype never even existed outside of some miniature 3D prints. And this is actually the prototype that we deployed in their shelter. And so that was that third step in that prototyping image that you saw. It was, you know, can we make an intervention that caps an existing shipping pallet to create a modular flooring system? And so, you know, we actually literally made this. We built a rotomold, or a thermomold, worked with a manufacturer here in Houston, and produced, you know, hundreds of these, and tested them out and shipped them to Sweden and tested them in the IKEA shelter. And that's an image of that prototype in their prototype. So it's a little meta, you know, prototype meaning prototype. Successful, and you know, unbeknownst to us until years later, that image ended up in the New York Times. No credit to us, but you know, IKEA has plenty of money to pump out PR, and so that relationship, that prototype, that experience was ultimately kind of credibility building, and it's another feature that I would want to address around prototyping, especially if you're writing, you know, a piece of software, an app, a physical thing. Nothing speaks to investors, funders like the real thing or some version of the real thing, right? You can talk all day long in abstract terms about the thing that you hope to do, but nothing speaks to them like a physical object that they can hold, even if it's at a smaller scale, or an app that like barely works, but like at least they can demonstrate some functionality behind it. That experience, the physical thing that we were able to put in the shelter that was really kind of buzzy at the moment, got us the attention of a special fund within USAID. We, using a lot of the imagery that we produced around our prototype, so the physical thing, we could take pictures of it and demonstrate, you know, hey, like it takes that question out of a lot of people's heads. Can these guys actually pull this off, right? A prototype, that's one of the other things that a prototype can do, is it pulls down that lack of credibility that you may have with funders, donors, et cetera. It demonstrates, hey, these guys might be able to pull this off. So we actually crowdfunded around that prototype, knowing even really that there were some more design iterations to come. So we landed that funding through USAID. It was a $165,000 grant. We raised 52 of our own. It was finally, we had a pot of money where we could actually go out there and test the prototype. So we took that shipping pallet cap idea to Iraq and Lebanon. It was the first time that we started working with the UN. It was the first time we started working with refugees. And we said, hey, here's our idea for flooring. We got the problem statement right, that these families lacked floors. This is the context where we piloted with our prototype. The mountain that you see in the background is Syria. We were working with families that had essentially just crossed over the border, and here they are. This is the camp setting. Zooming into a shelter, this is what the floor looks like, right? Pretty easy transferal there. These families, by the time we got there, many of them had already been living 4 years in the shelter. Those floors that we installed in 2015 are still being used by those same families in the same camps, right? So now many of those families are, 10, 11 years into living there, and at least now they're living with our flooring system. But we took that prototype, and it was the first time we could actually get feedback from the people who are actually going to use the thing, right? And there were some really critical design changes that came from that. You know, we were aware of some of the health benefits of having a clean floor versus a dirt. You know, we knew that parasitic infections would go down, diarrhea, anemia. All of those things really benefit from having a surface that you're living on that's clean and cleanable. But the thing that we learned from them was that the most pressing need that they had was that they were experiencing extremely brutal winters. And if you've ever camped in cold weather, I did last weekend, if you're laying directly on the freezing ground, like you'll never be warm. And so we took that insulated cap idea, or that cap idea, to a pallet, and we said, look, if we can add insulation to our floor, that's that final feature that really feels like, it's really hitting it. It's a modular. It meets all the kind of criteria that we had set out. It was lightweight, easy to install. You could retrofit a shelter with it. You could cut it with a knife, and it's insulated. And we felt like we had all those features So we created the final version of the prototype, and that's what we piloted. You know, so we took that prototype. It wasn't the go-to-market. It wasn't the most efficient manufacturing. You know, we got there later. We maximized, our manufacturing capabilities afterwards. But we were actually able to produce this insulated floor and test out: do people like it? Is it keeping them warmer? Is it saving them money with fuel? So the physical good that we produced was actually able to indicate success or not, real world viability or not. So you see some images of that final version. They're very lightweight. That's 2 boys carrying half a shelter's worth of floors to their shelter, and the image that you saw. And so that's the go-to-market. And a lot of the final forms and shape were really kind of just kind of chipping away at the prototype, maximizing material usage, bringing costs down, investing in a higher capacity mold than what we were able to in the pilot. And this is what we installed today. We've installed over 300,000 square feet of this. I've got 4 containers inbound to Lebanon right now. This year, we hope to reach about 4,500 more families, about 26,000 people inside Syria with this. And as an organization, it's why we're so attracted to products. If you're able to go through all those steps, design something that's really effective, go through all the steps of feedback, human-centered design, et cetera, and get a good product, your potential of reaching a lot of people is there. We can produce 2,000 tiles a day in the Middle Eastern region, and that's just that we can reach with a relatively small staff. So kind of in review of some of this, prototype asks or answers a question. It forces a process or action, right? You can theorize, you can imagine all day long what the thing is that you want to create is, but actually being forced to create it, or in some form or fashion, forces you to think through things that you're not going to think through if it's abstract. It tests assumptions that you've made. It demonstrates feasibility, like we talked about, and it can. And this is actually really important, especially unless you have some sort of trust fund from your parents or grandparents. The prototype is probably what you're going to use to attract funding. Prototypes are testable. That's really important. You're asking the prototype a question, and you need that prototype to help you answer that question. Do families like it? Can it keep them warmer? Is it easy to install? Whatever your question is, you want to design your prototype in a way where you can get that answer. Can it attract funding? That's a question too, that you can ask your prototype, and then you design that prototype around there. It's iterative, like we've talked about. You shouldn't expect that your first prototype is your only prototype. First, it should be fairly rapid. We have 3D printers, we have access to laser cutters, all these kind of rapid prototyping technologies we use regularly. Those are really great tools that we have in our arsenal now, because it allows us to create really high functioning, early stage, quick prototypes. What we model on our screens can turn into the physical thing fairly quickly. And then as it iterates, it should grow in sophistication. You should get closer and closer and closer to what the final product will be. And I want to add this in, the longer you kind of stay in the space, if you're all pursuing entrepreneurship, I think you'll find that people who develop this practice in their business, you'll see it translate into the way that they live their life, the way that they think through other business problems that may not be physical, right? You develop a mentality to prototype. And what does that mean? It can translate into a lot of different ways, but you conceptualize the thing that you want to do. You say, hey, I want to make it measurable, because you can't evaluate something unless it's measurable. You do it, you measure the outcome, you refine, you repeat. We do that with our fundraising. We're a 501c3, we fundraise. We do that with our emails. We send out A/B emails. This one has this subject line, this one has that. We look at the click rates, right? We have this mentality as an organization that we want to constantly be testing, improving, and refining what we do, how we communicate to our donors, how we communicate with foundations, how we create our products, obviously. And that's a more obvious translation of the prototype. I can stop for questions, and then I'm going to go through what we're currently working on with the prototype phase. there's any questions, I can kind of pause for a bit.
Does anyone have any questions for Scott?
How did you guys like analyze the costing of the prototypes? I'd imagine they're a lot more expensive than mass production, and kind of how you evaluated that and went about the sourcing process of those materials and whatnot.
That's a great question, and it's a really hard one to answer. You know, with the floors, it was more straightforward than what I'm about to present. You know, with the floors, I could take a 3D model, send it to a manufacturing company that we might contract manufacture with, and get quotes at different scales. So I could say, you know, what does pricing look like at 20,000, in order of 20,000, 100,000, et cetera. You know, so pricing in that sense was somewhat straightforward, because it was one thing that didn't need to be assembled. It's an injection molded process, and I could just ask for a quote. But you know, even still, there was a lot we didn't know about the logistics side and like costing that out. Shipping container quotes, but had no experience with clearing a shipping container through a Middle Eastern shipping port, and how much those taxes would be. And so it is kind of hard. It is kind of hard early on to understand what all your costs are going to be. You know, it really is. You want to make as kind of the most educated guesses as you can. You know, you get a quote, you know, add some contingency, in that, you know, you'll continue to kind of refine that understanding of your pricing as you go. But it is a challenging thing, especially if you're doing something that's fairly complex and there's not a lot of precedent for it. You know, say you're developing something, an app, and it may be unique and novel and no one's ever made one like it, but there's plenty of precedent for how much that should cost, how many engineers you might need to hire, et cetera. And so those are sometimes good go-bys. Sometimes your pricing is locked in, right? Like you can't charge, you know, $150 for an app, right? You're probably going to fall in some $3 to $6 range. And so you've got to kind of reverse engineer. It's like, well, it can't cost more than this. Like we have to be profitable at this. And so sometimes your pricing is set for you before you even get started. So that hopefully helpful. The answer is it's complicated. So any other questions before I rattle on?
Yeah, I've got a question. Oh, go ahead.
You can go ahead.
Okay. Did you have any experience working with, I don't want to say in the relief business because that sounds bad, but with different relief programs like FEMA or Red Cross or anything like that before you started on this, or was this completely new to you?
Yeah, completely new to me. And you shouldn't feel bad asking. It's an industry. You know, there are people who make their careers in it. So no, we didn't. You know, so I started this in 2012 in grad school with a buddy. For years, it was me and my buddy, you know, doing this thing. And I even had a full-time job for 5 years of it. But when we went to when we got through with our pilot, and there was clearly value, and it was clearly making a difference for the families that we wanted to work with, we brought on 2 co-founders that did have that experience. They had spent their whole careers working in that relief sector. So we recognized the knowledge gap, and when we actually formed the organization, we specifically found 2 co-founders that were passionate about what we were doing, liked the approach, but had that kind of knowledge gap that we were missing. So.
Great question, Conrad. Jose, I think you had a question as well.
Yes, I did. So I kind of wanted to touch on the psychological aspect of when you were working on the prototype. So what were some of the thoughts that were going through your head as you were working, such as if this were to fail and you wasted all the resources, how would you have reacted to it?
Yeah, I mean, we probably spent $20,000 prototyping, like just a rough guess. You know, and some of those prototypes obviously were not the thing that we went to market with. And a lot of times in all cases, the $20,000 were not our dollars. They were, you know, it was money people had given to us. And so I think because we were really early on in it, we didn't really have the right mindset around that. It did feel wasteful. you wanted to get it right the first time. Now with almost a decade of experience, like I recognize that like it's part of the journey. You don't want to waste resources, but you're not going to get it right the first time, and that shouldn't be the expectation. In theory, it'd be great if you knew all of the design variables. In our case, especially early on when we had almost no access and exposure to the end user and to the refugee relief organizations, we were guessing, right? So a lot of our early prototypes were really, really far off. We had the problem right in some ways, but we didn't understand all the design variables. And so a lot of our iteration was just really learning more design variables that we weren't aware of before. And I think in other circumstances, you may pilot and understand that all the benefits are not there. Like you haven't gotten the product right yet, and that may be your version of a changing set of variables that you have to design to. But like I don't know. I would imagine you'd be hard pressed to find anybody that hasn't gotten some of their early prototypes just completely wrong and wasted resources. And if you hear anything from me, if you're asking that question, don't be discouraged by it. Don't be discouraged by it. You don't want to waste too much, because at some point you lose faith for whoever might be funding the endeavor. But I think if you have a good trusting relationship with the funder and they understand that you're earnestly and getting closer and closer every time, I think they can see that journey and they may have that perspective.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I guess, what is your advice for people who are prototyping a concept that doesn't necessarily have a physical solution, if that makes sense? Like a service.
Give me a little bit more.
So let's say a company is trying to redefine their brand in a certain way, and you have to figure out how to help them with that. How would you necessarily prototype something like that?
It's still pretty abstract for me, but I hope I can be helpful, and you're welcome to share specifics. It's a pretty small group. So, but it's who's the audience, right? Who's the end user? Who's consuming whatever it is that you want validation on? Like what you're looking for is to set out a hypothesis that maybe this brand or this approach or this messaging is better than that one, right? So it could look like, you say, think about it like a science experiment. I think that this would be more effective than that. I think that if we present ourselves this way, it would be better than that. You set a hypothesis that now you can test, and then you have to say, okay, what does success look like? And part of that is defining who is it that is consuming that end user. If it's branding, if it's messaging, and you can identify who your customer is, who the end user, who the consumer is, can you survey them? Can you A/B test this versus that? Here's what we have now. What do you think of this? This is pretty far out of like what I'm good at, what I do, but there is going to be a way that you can, set the problem up, identify the customer, and get some sort of validatable, data from it. Does that help at all, Raquel?
Yes, it does a lot.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, we can talk about Tarps now, something that you have always wanted to know more about. Everybody gets excited about Tarps. So I'm here for you. We're going to talk about Tarps. Let's get nerdy. The families that we work with rely heavily on Tarps, textiles, to form almost the entirety of their shelter. Their shelter is two things. Usually it's a structure of some kind, and then it's a textile stretched over it. We call it tarp, tarpaulin, sheeting. Those are all the names that it goes by. The space that I am in is not particularly innovative. That's probably a conversation for a different day. The technology, if you want to call it that you see behind in this picture behind this family, it's the same material that British soldiers used at the end of World War II. It's cotton woven together, dipped in chemicals. It's treated canvas. It fails within about 4 to 6 months. I didn't start my presentation. I should have given you a little bit of context. There's about 30 million refugees who live in camp settings, and they'll do so for 12 to 17 years on average, right? So just imagine camping, you're in this picture. That family is going to attempt to live there for 12 to 17 years. All the kids that you're seeing in this picture will go from childhood to college age living in that shelter, right? It may change, they may get some new tarps, but that tarp is going to fail 3 to 6 months in, and if they're lucky, 2 or 3 years later, they'll get something else. It's pretty messed up. This is the other technology, if you want to call it that gets used a lot. This is more like what you'd go to Home Depot, Lowe's, and pick up. It's a woven tarp. It's high density polyethylene. I just wrote an article if you're really interested and you really want to get nerdy about this. But it fails again about 4 to 6 months in. It's cheaper to produce. It's lighter weight. In some ways, it's an improvement over the 1940s technology. This technology was invented in the 1970s, and at the time, it was groundbreaking. It was a huge advancement. You know, it was kind of this miracle humanitarian good at the time. When you're asking a family to live for 12 to 17 years, you need a product that lasts for more than a few months. And it's a massive problem. So right now I'm defining the problem statement. We obviously know who the consumer is in this case. I was in Lebanon doing a flooring project and I saw this shelter. This is a billboard that's being used as a tarp instead of a traditional tarp. It was really visually striking. I'm a designer at heart and by training, but you know, it was very visually striking to see this. Even more striking, we got to know this family. They had been using this billboard for 2 years and hadn't had any issues. No leaking, no ripping, no cracking. You know, and you never know where, you know, the next idea is going to come from. You know, necessity is the mother of all invention. And, you know, there's a lot, and this is kind of fundamental to like our approach to this human-centered design. These families are these families are the world's experts as it relates to tarps, right? Why? They rely on them every day. You don't have to. You don't know more about tarps than these families do. You may know more about the technical specifications, but you don't know as well as they do about how it fails, what does well, and what doesn't do well. So that's really central to like our philosophy in general. The system as it is now has no way to prioritize what a family thinks, experiences, et cetera. And so they miss a lot of potential innovations. So here's this really cool idea, this material that's clearly performing very well. In a way, it's kind of an as-found prototype, right? They did the prototyping for us and we're just observing it 2 years later. How lucky for us. It turns out that I did not know much about this industry. It's called the out-of-home industry. You know, I'll use billboard just for our sake. In the United States, there's about 800 million square feet of this material produced. It's PVC. I stupidly didn't bring a sample with me to my computer. It's not a woven product. It's an extruded product. It's got fiberglass mesh embedded into it. What I'm trying to get at is it's really badass tarp, right? It is strong in ways that a refugee tarp is weak. The reasons why a refugee product fails, this has actually been engineered to succeed in that way. If you think about a billboard, just imagine it as a giant sail, like on a sailboat, right? It's taking wind load constantly. So it has to be strong in a tensile strength. That's actually one of the big reasons why a refugee tarp fails. And it's a waste stream, right? It turns out these companies pay to get rid of this. You know, so we, slide's a little out of place. We'll go here. So we built what we call our prototype shelter, right? We built a version of a refugee shelter that we might find in the field, and we got our hands on some of this material. And at a very basic level, we just said, okay, let's try it. You know, can we make a good shelter using this material? And so this is a Tim Hortons Keurig ad. You know, billboards are usually 14 feet by 48 feet. We designed the shelter to basically use every last square inch of the billboard material. We kind of maximized. It was kind of a fun design challenge, but the material is great. You know, we actually used that tarp for over 8 months, and it had no visible signs of any kind of distress. But the problem with using this material is that no one wants the ad to be present, right? So the design challenge wasn't, hey, can we make some connections? Can we partner? Can we just start throwing this stuff into the field? The billboard companies are very protective of their clients' branding, right? Tim Hortons may or may not be thrilled to see their ad end up in a refugee camp, right? Probably not thrilled. Humanitarian organizations that we work closely with don't want to see ads on refugee shelters, right? It's seen as monetizing human suffering. So the big challenge with this material wasn't its availability. There was so much that was compelling about this. But the challenge was, how do we actually use this giant, massive waste stream in a way that can protect the client's branding and present a dignity-bearing product to our families. So our first idea, right? Cut the thing into strips, heat weld it together, mix and match, and then heat weld the thing back together. It takes the branding out of the picture, creates this really beautiful tarp, right? This was an ad for gonorrhea, some other STDs. And I say that only because we ran a lot of kind of visual experiments before we made any. We found the most offensive billboards we could find online, and we kind of put it through this process. We said, hey, can we erase all offensiveness out of these billboards in this way? And I think I believe if I hadn't told you that was a billboard for STDs, you would know it. It just ends up being a really kind of compelling looking tarp. So then we found a group that heat welded. I didn't know anything about billboards. That my team didn't. We didn't know anything about heat welding. We're kind of scrappy. I suspect many of you are as well. We found an organization out of Ohio that heat welds. Typically, they're heat welding with. My computer's about to die, and I don't know why because I'm plugged in. Sorry about this, guys. So I'm not sure why my, see if that's gonna go. Okay, there we go. Sorry about this.
You're fine. Don't even worry about it.
Okay, all right, back to it. So we found a company out of Ohio that heat welded. They typically use heat welding to make party tents, awnings for buildings, et cetera. This was a weird application for them. They thought it was really cool. They thought they could get some good PR out of it. I say all that just to say they did all of this for free for us. So they have machines that basically cut the material into strips. They've got machines that heat weld, and they actually sent us many full-size tarps out of this. Another prototype that we tried was literally just painting over the ad, right? Just coat it. There's some advantages for having a white tarp. It increases its thermal properties, et cetera. And so we said, hey, can we just use a coating to solve this problem? We tried a lot of different coatings, and every time I just ended up with like a gumball mess. We could never kind of crack the code on something that had the same elasticity as the billboard. And in hot Texas summers when we were doing this, that didn't heat up the coating enough to just adhere the thing to itself. All the while we were kind of refining the variables. So much of prototyping, so much of developing a product is nonlinear. You are going to learn things while you're prototyping that you didn't know and are actually really critical to the design of the thing. One of the things that we learned / wanted to focus on as an organization was we had moved our manufacturing of our flooring from China to Turkey, and we saw a lot of benefits for localizing the production there. And so we started asking ourselves, okay, look, what would it look like to fully localize the production of this tarp? Well, it wasn't going to be painting. Painting didn't work. It wasn't going to be heat welding. Heat welding is somewhat of a common technology, but it wasn't, let's just say it wasn't readily available in a lot of the places that we work, but sewing is. So we said, look, if we can make a tarp that meets all these design criteria that's sewn, we're potentially finally kind of cracking on something that's going to work. We as an organization really love the idea of being economically inclusive. If we can actually employ refugees to make the products that other refugees are going to consume, women-led organizations, et cetera, in these areas, that's the better way to do it, right? And then we developed relationships with billboard companies that were actually in Eastern Africa, where we're gonna pilot this. And so the vision came into our view as, okay, look, we're gonna collect all the material locally, we're gonna manufacture it locally, we're gonna pilot it locally. And if we use sewing as that technology, sewing is universally available. You'd be hard pressed to find a country on earth where there isn't sewing happening. And if we can develop this product to be sewn, not heat welded, no fancy technology, no adhesives, this is something that we could actually presumably do and transplant where it's needed. And so we simply took the billboard, the ad itself, and folded it in on itself, creating a double layer tarp. It's kind of the most straightforward, simple possible solution, right? It was actually when we were doing, trying to remember the guy, Connor, asked a question about pricing. So all the while we're cost modeling this. You know, I benefited from having 4 MBA interns last summer. Thank you, bad economy. You know, had, you know, working for a nonprofit was probably not what they thought they would do, but I think it was a cool summer. We spent a lot of time cost modeling every version of this, you know, paint, heat welding, you know, how many inches per minute, you know, learning all these variables that, you know, no one ever thought they were going to have to learn to see like, okay, is this ever going to be viable, right? Sewing was absolutely far and away the cheapest. It's universally done, and it actually doubles up the material. So presumably we have a material that's actually double the thickness. So that's kind of where we are, right? This year we're going to pilot in Uganda. Every shelter has other products, other things that we do, but these are kind of good, kind of prototypey type things. But talking about that prototype mentality, it isn't just a material pilot, right? We're going to pilot the material production procurement. I'm sorry. Where are we going to get it from? How good is it? What's that quantity? How feasible is this at scale, right? Can I make thousands, tens of thousands of tarps only gathering materials from the region? It seems like we can. There's one sure way to test it out, and that's to push on the system to actually do the thing, to force that system to move. Production. We have a lot of different ways that we can produce this tarp. We're gonna produce them in all formats. We're working with a group of refugee-led social entrepreneurs that are going to sew some tarps for us. Some women-led organizations that are local to Uganda that are going to sew some tarps for us. We're going to pay them for every one of them. We're going to provide them the material, but then we're also going to produce it at some larger factories. You know, because a lot of times the scale that we deal at is it may be beyond that capacity, but I'm really hopeful that the social enterprises are able to collectively produce a capacity that's really meaningful and good quality. And then the final version of the product is the one that seems the most straightforward. How does the product do? You know, we benefited from the fact that we found an as-found condition, families that were already using it. We surveyed them. You know, how do you like it? We know that those families in Lebanon really preferred it over the standard tarp. So we're a little less worried about total acceptance, but there are some features, some things that we can do this tarp that I think will add benefits to these families, and we want to hear back from them. Consequently, setting up production close by means that we can start iterating that final production pretty quickly. You know, I can go to the refugee settlement where we're going to work in, has 118,000 residents. I can hear from them about features they would want to see. I can go back to Kampala. We can hammer out a few tarps. We can bring it back and get feedback. So, you know, closing in that iteration loop is really helpful, especially if you're running an organization. So that is the end of my, I think I gave us 15 minutes for conversation.
I want to open it up to students, but Scott, I do have a quick question because I know a little piece of your organization's story and that you guys have also used these shelters for disaster relief in the US. And so I'm just wondering, that's another form of kind of piloting or programming you guys did. Would you encourage people to look for opportunities to pilot products outside of their actual end target user or not, based off of that experience?
So it's very possible that something that you're working on has a market for it that you didn't initially intend for. That would be like one way to answer that question. So we're doing this project. We're in Houston. I live through Harvey. We get hurricanes here, live in the Gulf. And there were some nonprofits that knew we were working on a tarp project. We had some ideas that there might be some relevance in that for that need. And specifically what I mean is, you know, when a hurricane hits, especially if it's a significant wind event, the shingles fly off people's roofs. I know that you know, Northwest Arkansas gets enough, you know, wind activities, tornadoes, et cetera, to know that. But, you know, local disasters produce a need for a tarp, right? You tarp a roof. Tarping someone's roof means that they can stay in their home instead of going to a shelter. It means that they're not doing further damage to the sheathing on their roof. So we had some notions that there may be some relevance in disaster relief, but that's not what our organization did. we had some initial conversations over the summer with a few disaster relief organizations just to ask, you know, what is the experience with the FEMA tarp? You know, the tarps that you're able to get, the experiences were not good. They don't last very long. They're very small. They're expensive. And so 2 days before Hurricane Laura hit, we thought it was going to hit Houston. And I had 2 different large nonprofits call me and say, hey, how many of these tarps do you have? And we said, well, we only have 100, but we have partnerships. We can get a lot more. We ended up deploying 4,200 of these tarps, helped about 11,000 disaster victims this year. And it was completely unexpected. We had done a lot of the legwork to make that possible. We had a mindset that there may be other applications for it, but it's absolutely possible that you prototype something thinking you're hitting a certain market, and you actually find that you created more value somewhere else. And maybe you completely pivot, or maybe you're able to serve both needs. So
that's great. Yeah, I think it's to me as an outsider, it looks like a great opportunity to have just continued to test and find potentially more information about a product you're already working on. Does anyone else have any questions for Scott? We have him for a few more minutes here.
Yeah, I've got another question. Are there any major trade-offs that you had to make, either, you know, with the flooring or with the tarps, that you kind of had to, you know, make a decision about, like with weight, like one is a lot better, but it weighed a lot. And then is there anything that the billboard tarps don't do as well as the traditional tarps?
Yep. Yeah. So on the flooring, you know, I think as outsiders, we had in our mind the standard being what you would consider military spec. You know, just as shorthand for like, man, this is really rugged. This is, you know, this is going to last forever in horrible conditions. What we didn't fully appreciate is how cost constrained this is. So even though families are being, you know, effectively forced to camp for 12 to 17 years, they may be allotted a maximum of $500 per 5 years. That's not very much money, right? And so military spec, something that robust and rugged wasn't going to be possible. So we really had to think through that balance of cost and durability. Our oldest floors are 6 years old. You know, it costs about $100 to get one in a family shelter. So that trade-off is really there. You know, we think we balanced it really well, but, you know, we didn't really appreciate, you know, that balance of cost constraint and durability. The tarps, because it's a used product, there's going to be a massive number of headaches around it. So you're going to get varying qualities. So there's going to be like a high burden on sorting, cleaning, et cetera, versus using a virgin material that you can just rely on being pretty consistent quality. So that's definitely a trade-off that we're mindful of. It's one of the advantages of basing the production closer to where it's needed. Just frankly speaking, labor rates are different. They're lower. So a lot of that manual side of it does create jobs, but it doesn't do it in a way that really kills the viability from a cost perspective. So.
Great question. Anyone else? Jose, did you have a question? I thought I saw you unmute there.
Yeah. So so I have a question. So from your experience with tarps, do you now have a sudden respect or appreciation for tarps? Are you fascinated by it now?
Yeah, I mean, I used to tell people I never thought I'd be so passionate about flooring. You know, when you're in second grade telling people what you wanted to do for a living, that's, you know, being a florist, you know, wouldn't probably make many people's lists. I am extremely passionate and know a whole lot about flooring, the health implications, and now I know a whole lot about the billboard industry. I actually did a keynote address at the big billboard conference. There's obviously one of those in October. I know a lot about it. I know a lot more about the industry than probably is even relevant. I love learning new things. I think a lot of entrepreneurs that they like that part, right? You know, you never thought you'd know so much about a subject, but you kind of consume that information voraciously. It's really interesting, especially to come in as an outsider. burrow into like an industry that you know nothing about and just try to understand it as best you can. It's really interesting in the material itself. But there's always going to be constraints, and you know, now that we're at the stage where we are, because we're a 501c3, we rely extremely heavily on expert volunteers. You know, there's only going to be there's a limit to like how much I can understand. You know, so we rely a lot on experts that can kind of help bridge that. So we have executives in the out-of-home space, former presidents of groups like Clear Channel on our advisory committee. You know, and those people also just kind of help you, you know, get the introductions that you need to actually make partnerships happen. So, you know, once you have a little bit of success, it's really incredible how much it can kind of build on itself. You know, the fact that we have successfully developed a flooring system at scale, it made it easier to ask for, you know, partnerships for a new product, for example. We kind of have that credibility to build on. So.
I had a question about the prototyping mentality. So how do you know when to stop refining and repeating those like 4 other steps, or are you always refining and repeating?
So that's where that MVP would come in, right? The minimum viable product. You know, how soon, like if you're in a for-profit, how soon can I get somebody to pay me for this, right? That's when you know you're done, right? And you're not done improving. You know, I think in almost all contexts, you're constantly looking for ways to improve your product, right? At some point, you have to commercialize it. At some point, you have to ask people to pay for it. So you're really not done until somebody is willing to pay for it. And then is that a big enough marketplace to sustain you? So. And then prototype mentality for your own self, you know. And I don't know, I'm not a big Tim Ferriss guy. A lot of people who think that way really like Tim Ferriss. Look him up. But he really kind of takes that approach to like the way he lives his life, what he eats, how much he sleeps, etc. Some people take it kind of all the way through their life. I'm not like that, but. Jose smiled. It looks like Jose probably likes Tim Ferriss.
Yeah, I've read a lot of his books. I'm
Yeah.
familiar with it.
That's great. Is anyone working on a prototype in particular right now, currently? Not in this group? Okay.
Morgan is.
I'm currently working on a prototype, yes.
What is it, Morgan?
I'm doing like it's really just for a hobby, but I've kind of turned it into a business. But it's like hand-shaved wake surfboards.
Okay.
So I've
hand-shaved wake surfboards.
Shaped.
Sorry.
I like polyethylene. So I've actually shaped my first board, but it's a long way from being complete. But that's
cool.
just a part of it. So.
Raquel, do you want to be more specific about your question earlier? We have a couple minutes.
Well, I'm a project lead and my group is working with Leisure List, and we're trying to help them become a more diverse and equitable and inclusive brand, and that's difficult. Yeah. So I was just trying to figure out a good way to present that to people as kind of a product, but I didn't know how to do that. So.
Yeah, I mean, you know, what's the end goal? I think would be the first question. You know, like what do you hope to accomplish, and what do you hope? You know, is it outcome based? Is it, you know, is it relational? Is it what is it? You know, because I think once you ask what you're trying to get to, you can start to put some measurements to it. You know, and then you can start to, you know, do small steps to, you know, get to validating those measurements. You know, hey, we did this little experiment and we saw this result. I think if we do more of it, we'll get more of that result, the kind of thing. But yeah, that is a unique prototyping challenge, but I think you can apply a lot of the same, you know, mindset.
That's awesome. Hey guys, we still have a few more minutes, so you can hang out here and ask questions to Scott. He is a really good friend. Thank you, Scott, for being here. I love the story. I think of prototyping through the lens of Every Shelter and a lot of Scott's work, just because it helps me remember to have that prototyping mindset. So I hope it helps you guys as well as you go throughout your work and projects. I put Scott's LinkedIn here and in the chat if you want to connect with him. He's more than happy to connect with you. I also put his article that he wrote through Every Shelter. It's kind of about nerding out over the Tarp story. So that is in the chat as well. And then the last little plug here is that I put a survey for us. So if you want to give us feedback about both Scott and our workshops, that's always welcome. And thank you guys for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Scott.
Of course.